In the 1970s, Pennsylvania's steel mills ran all night, casting an orange glow over towns where paychecks came with union promises of security and pride. Families built lives on steady shifts, marble stoops, and block parties, believing the state's backbone could never bend. Yet beneath this sense of certainty, small changes were already in motion. What did it really mean to live in Pennsylvania before everything changed? The day began before sunrise, when the air in Pittsburgh's mill towns already tasted faintly of metal and smoke. Fathers and sons walked together toward the gates, boots thudding against the pavement, lunch pails in hand. Inside the mill, the world narrowed to heat, clang, and motion. The shift whistle cut through the morning quiet, signaling thousands to their posts, some on the furnace floor, others guiding overhead cranes, each role learned by repetition and necessity. Molten steel glowed a fierce orange as it poured from ladles into waiting molds. The air shimmered with heat, dust swirling in the shafts of light that broke through high windows. Conversations happened in shouts over the roar of machinery. Gloves and heavy aprons shielded arms from sparks, but faces still bore the shine of sweat and the grit of the day. For the men on the floor, every movement counted. A misstep near the molten stream could mean disaster, yet the rhythm of the shift felt steady, almost familiar. Each man knew his place. Some had worked these lines for decades. Others were just learning, often from families standing beside them. 12-hour shifts rotated around the clock, with crews changing at midnight, dawn, and late afternoon. On the hottest days, the mill's heat pressed down even harder, but the promise of a steady wage kept spirits anchored. Between tasks, quick breaks offered a chance for a sip of coffee or a bite of a sandwich, sometimes a Primanti Brothers classic stacked with fries inside the bread, practical for a meal on the go. The end of the shift was marked by another whistle, a sound that echoed across the valley and signaled relief. Boots tracked black dust back out onto the street. Fathers and sons walked home together, their faces streaked but their steps sure, carrying the pride of work that built more than just steel, it built lives, and a sense that the future was as solid as the beams they forged. In the Union Hall, a steward stood before the crowd, reading from the freshly signed contract. The words carried weight. For every 0.3 of a point rise in the Consumer Price Index, each worker would see another cent per hour in their paycheck. That was the promise of the new cost of living adjustment written into the 1973 Experimental Negotiating Agreement. It meant that as prices crept up, wages would keep pace, no more watching paychecks shrink while groceries and gas grew more expensive. Union victories like this didn't just show up in pay envelopes. They shaped the way families planned for the future. Company-paid health care covered doctor visits and hospital stays, taking some of the worry out of raising a family. Pensions promised a steady income after decades on the line, making early retirement a real possibility for those who had spent their lives in the mill. The steward reminded everyone, these gains weren't handed out. They were won, secured by bargaining, and protected by collective strength. A steelworker could count on a wage that covered more than just the basics. With a steady paycheck, families put down payments on row houses that cost around $20,000. Kids grew up expecting to stay in school longer, sometimes even heading to college, something their grandparents could only dream about. The union contract was more than a set of rules. It was a foundation. It made home ownership feel possible, and it gave workers the confidence to build lives that would last. Every quarter, as the steward posted the new cost of living adjustment figures on the union bulletin board, it was a quiet reminder that hard work came with real rewards. The mill was dangerous, the hours were long, but the contract turned risk into security. This was how a job became a future, and how a paycheck became a promise kept. Marble steps caught the first light of morning as a block captain swept a thin layer of last night's dust into the gutter, her broom tracing the same lines her mother once did. On these tight city blocks, every stoop was a front row seat to the neighborhood's daily story. In winter, kids in puffy jackets carved trails, through fresh snow, their shouts echoing between rows of brick homes. The corner store opened early, its bell ringing for regulars, for milk and bread, and for a pack of cigarettes for the father on his way to the plant. Churches stood at the end of each block, their bells marking time for families who had lived here for generations. Saturday afternoons brought the sound of polka drifting from open windows, and every so often a neighbor would call out from their porch, inviting the next stoop over to a church festival or a block party. Gossip traveled faster than the trolley, passed from one marble step to the next, especially as dusk settled and porch lights flickered on. In these neighborhoods, belonging was not a question. It was built into the brick, carried in every ritual, and handed down like a family recipe. Trolleys rattled down Broad Street before dawn, filling quickly with shoppers headed for Center City and South Philly. By 8, the sidewalks around Wanamaker's and Litt Brothers pulsed with families, each clutching lists for the week ahead. Inside the grand department stores, perfume mingled with the scent of new leather shoes. Escalators ferried children past mannequins in Sunday best, while mothers compared prices on school clothes and fathers eyed the latest radios behind glass counters. A few blocks south, the Italian market buzzed with a different energy. Vendors called out in a mix of English and Italian, their stalls crowded with fresh sausage, peppers, and crusty rolls. Shoppers haggled over the price of tomatoes, sometimes winning an extra handful for a smile or a joke. Cannoli boxes balanced atop grocery bags as neighbors traded recipes and news between stops. The market's rhythm was unhurried but constant, each exchange reinforcing ties that stretched back generations. By late afternoon, arms heavy with packages, families boarded trolleys for the ride home. The city's heartbeat slowed as stalls closed and lights flickered off, but the memory of Saturday's bustle lingered, proof that, for one day each week, the city belonged to its people. A moving truck idled in the driveway of a split-level house. Its back doors were open as boxes were carried inside. For many first-time buyers in the outer counties, this was the reward for years of shift work and careful saving. A union-wage couple, both still in their 20s, set down a crate marked kitchen and looked out over their own patch of lawn, a yard their parents could only have imagined. The mortgage was fixed at just over $200 a month, with a 20-year term and a down payment scraped together from overtime and holiday bonuses. Inside, the smell of new paint lingered. Out back, the grass still showed lines from the builder's roller, and already a neighbor called over the fence to introduce himself. By the weekend, a barbecue was underway, with hot dogs, potato salad, and kids chasing each other between yards. On Monday morning, the husband set out before sunrise, coffee in hand, joining a line of sedans heading toward the city. The commute was longer now, but every mile meant more space, quieter nights, and the sense of something earned. For families like this, the suburbs offered not just a house, but a foothold, a sign that steady work could open doors and that keys could pass from one generation to the next. In Lancaster County, the morning moved at a different pace. An Amish farmer guided his team of Belgians through a field, the leather harness worn but sturdy, mended by hand last winter in the quiet of the barn. The plow cut a straight furrow, soil turning in the same way it had for generations. There was no engine rumble here, just the steady rhythm of hooves and the soft creak of wood and iron. Inside the barn, lantern light flickered against hand-hewn beams. Tools hung from pegs, each one shaped by its owner. On certain days, neighbors gathered for a barn raising. Men and boys lifting timbers together while women prepared tables heavy with bread, chow-chow, and apple butter. No one worked for pay. The day's labor belonged to the community, each family taking its turn in the cycle of giving and receiving. Electric lines stopped at the edge of the property. In these barns, light came from kerosene, and the only hum was the sound of bees drifting through an open window. Laundry flapped on long wooden racks, white against the green of the pasture. As dusk settled, the farmer steered his buggy along a gravel lane, wheels crunching in the quiet. He would pass neighbors on their own way home, each nod or wave a small affirmation of belonging. The work was hard, but the certainty of the land offered a kind of calm. Seasons marked by planting and harvest, days measured by the sun, and pride found in the things made by hand. A bell jingled above the door as the diner owner wiped down the counter, stacking plates in careful towers for the next rush. Every shift brought its own crowd, night workers coming off the line, farmers in before sunrise, families sliding into booths after church on Sundays. The coffee urn bubbled non-stop, sending up steam that mingled with the scent of frying onions and bacon. On the griddle, eggs sizzled for breakfast sandwiches, while a baker in the back room dusted flour across loaves destined for lunch pails and market stands. By noon, the kitchen window filled with orders, chipped ham on rye, bowls of chicken corn soup, and platters of pierogies browned in butter. Some customers ordered hoagies wrapped tight in wax paper, easy to tuck into a lunchbox or eat one-handed on the job. Others wanted the diner's own version of a cheesesteak, hot and messy, dripping onto the plate. Bakery trucks rattled down alleys before dawn, delivering fresh Kaiser rolls to corner stores and sandwich shops. On Sundays, lines curled out the door for sticky buns and rye bread, the shelves emptying before noon. Between bites, talk drifted across the counter, how the Phillies were doing, whose kid made honor roll, which bakery had the best poppy seed rolls this week. Food here wasn't just fuel, it was a way to keep families going, a reason for neighbors to linger a little longer, and a reminder that every table, no matter how crowded, had room for one more. On autumn Sundays, the city's pulse shifted. Steel mill whistles fell silent just before kickoff, their echo replaced by a low, building excitement that swept through streets and living rooms alike. In Pittsburgh, workers poured out of the mills, still in boots and jackets, crowding into corner bars or gathering around console televisions. The air filled with the scent of pretzels and Iron City beer as the first notes of the broadcast theme played. For a few hours, the weight of the week lifted. Every touchdown sent a roar rolling down the block, rattling windows and drawing neighbors onto porches. The Steelers, led by Terry Bradshaw and the Steel Curtain defense, captured 4 Super Bowl titles between 1974 and 1979. Each win belonged not just to the team, but to the entire city, factory hands, shopkeepers, bus drivers, and school kids, all claiming a piece of the victory. In Philadelphia, the Flyers hoisted the Stanley Cup in back-to-back seasons, 1974 and 1975, their Broad Street Bullies style matching the grit of their fans. Orange and black flags hung from row house windows, and parades filled South Broad Street with a sea of faces, young and old, singing and waving. Even Penn State football drew families together on crisp Saturdays. Radios tuned in kitchens and garages from Erie to Scranton. Sports didn't just entertain, they affirmed identity. In mill towns, factory sirens sometimes paused for big games, and shift schedules bent to playoff runs. Children learned to count by jersey numbers, and grandmothers wore lucky pins on game day. When the final whistle sounded and the city erupted in celebration, it felt as if the whole state had won something together. For a moment, every worry faded into the background, replaced by a sense of pride that ran deeper than steel or coal, a pride that could carry a community through any winter. By the late 1970s, the air above Pittsburgh and the valleys of the Monongahela still hung heavy most mornings, a blue-gray haze drifting from smokestacks of the steel mills that never seemed to sleep. The smoke was part of the bargain, proof of steady work, and a constant presence settling on cars and laundry lines, softening the outlines of row houses at dawn. On winter mornings, the sky sometimes blurred into the mills themselves. Headlights glowed faint as workers made their way to early shifts. Further east, the sound of rain against the roof could mean something different. In June 1972, the Susquehanna River crested its banks after days of relentless downpour, flooding Wilkes Barre and the Wyoming Valley. Families watched live updates on black and white TV sets as water rose past porches and crept through living rooms. Neighbors carried furniture to second floors, hoping the river would stop. When the water finally receded, mud-covered streets and the smell of damp lingered for weeks. The cleanup took months, but even then, most people spoke of what they had saved, not what they had lost. By 1973, lines of cars curled around gas stations, engines idling as drivers waited for their turn at the pump. Some mornings, the line stretched 2 blocks before sunrise, and signs hung in windows reading "No gas today." In living rooms, the news brought talk of rationing and odd, even license plate days. Parents worried quietly about how far a tank would go, but still found ways to get to work, to church, to the corner store. Smog, floods, and shortages were part of the backdrop, rarely spoken of unless they forced their way in. Most days, life pressed on, a little slower, sometimes with a hint of unease, but always with the sense that tomorrow would bring another chance to put things right. Today, fewer than 10% of Pennsylvania's workforce belongs to a union, down from nearly 1 in 3 in the 1970s. That sense of unshakable security has faded, but the memory of it still shapes what many hope for in community and work. In a world chasing certainty, that feeling endures as a quiet benchmark. Let the echoes of that era remind us what stability once meant.